Hi, my name is Jack Lawrence. For the past 3 years or so, I've made videos primarily on TikTok around science and philosophy, although you can find some of them on this channel. I recently turned 30 and thought it would be fun to do a Q&A. Plus also, I'm doing that classic TikToker thing of trying to migrate over to the greener pastures of YouTube. So here are a collection of questions I received mainly through TikTok. Hopefully there's something here you'll find interesting. And of course, you'll see all the different timestamps in the description should you want to jump about. So without further ado, Saya asks, congratulations on turning 30. I feel like I must ask, what was your inspiration to create these philosophy-based videos in the first place? The short answer to this question is I initially got my start on TikTok making videos around the philosophy of science. I found that very satisfying, and then I sort of drifted into an interview-style format whereby I interviewed characters who embodied, or to the best of my abilities, embodied different philosophies. And then it sort of slowly dawned on me that it was more fun to talk about philosophy with two or more characters as opposed to me just narrating it to the screen. The longer answer to that question is I used to do improv comedy for about 5 years very seriously before COVID happened, or as seriously as you can do improv, I guess. I took shows up to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival and did a tour in the US. It was a really good time. And I'd bought this camera, which I'm filming on now, to film our shows. But of course, when lockdown happened, all in-person theatre stopped, and I thought to myself, I'm such a creative snowflake, I need some sort of outlet. And so I started making videos. And I promised myself I'd do it for a year because I knew I'd be bad at it at first because I hadn't really made videos before. And in the 51st week of that 52-week stretch, I had a video on the philosophy of time, which I put on TikTok, where I stitched something that Hank Green said. It blew up, or at least for me. Ended up getting around 600,000 views or so. And that was sort of my foothold on the TikTok platform, if you like. And then from there, I made videos on the philosophy of physics and science, some videos on physics generally, and then slowly drifted over to philosophy. So, Norden Visa asks, does your skits help you some way personally? Yes, they definitely do help me in a number of ways. The most obvious is that they help me succinctly articulate the thoughts, or quite often the conflicting thoughts and feelings I have on a topic. But also, oftentimes when writing a script, you're forced to advance your thinking, and that can make either a dilemma clearer or sometimes resolve it, and it's really nice when that happens. Usually the inspiration for a sketch is a conversation with a friend or something I've read, and so even though oftentimes my videos are around topics which I myself haven't necessarily landed on one side of the fence on, sometimes when I've made a video, really all I'm left with is a clearer sense of uncertainty. I try and live my life in such a way that I don't hold views which I think are perfect, because no view is perfect, no idea is without flaw. It's a big red flag to me if someone holds an opinion and they can't articulate the case against it. So for me, it's useful because it's humbling. I know the problems with perhaps the convictions I have, but I can hold on to them thinking that they are the least worst ideas I've come across so far. So yes, they do help me. Arson is okay writes, happy belated birthday, wishing you all the best. Could you talk more about what books you enjoy, favorite authors, philosophy recs, etc., if you haven't already? Yes, absolutely. So right off the bat, I have a list of recommended books from philosophy to novels and nonfiction, which you can find pretty easily. But in general, I'd say some of my favorite authors are essayists like Tim Kreider or David Foster Wallace. I think the creative nonfiction essay is a really nice amalgamation of essentially being able to rant philosophically about something, but also do some storytelling and just present complex and nuanced thinking in a really deep yet engaging way. And that's the kind of writing I aspire to try and emulate, I suppose, insofar as I do writing. Thomas Layton asks, for the Q&A, how would you recommend a beginner approach philosophy? I really enjoy hearing your more philosophical content, but I don't know where to start for myself. So, where should a beginner start with philosophy? I have two answers to this question. The first is anywhere, which is to say that there are so many resources online, podcasts, YouTube, free lectures. Find a question which intrigues you, and maybe even just Google it or YouTube search it and see what comes up. I don't think there's necessarily a quote-unquote right way to approach philosophy if you're doing it out of a spirit of just curiosity. The second answer to this question is if you're a beginner who's interested in philosophy in a more academic sense. So philosophy, obviously, in the most broadest possible terms, you can learn about philosophy through a good movie or a good novel. But if you want to be able to talk about Socrates or Plato or Nietzsche or J.S. Mill, then you probably should acquaint yourself with some of the thinkers or canonical texts which make up a lot of the Western canon of philosophy. And so if you want to go that route, then depending on whether you want to study at university or again, you're just curious, I'd look at reading lists, or even, I know this might sound too simplistic, go on Wikipedia. Like, one of the really hard things to do with philosophy is to categorize different thinkers, but Wikipedia kind of has to do this automatically. So you can get a sense through there how the different thinkers are categorized with respect to one another, and oftentimes how they relate to one another. You can get to know the sort of figures and the story of philosophy. I've got a bunch of recommendations which are more to that ilk, so giving you a broad overview of the history of Western philosophy, or indeed a starting point to philosophy as a whole. There are tons of good books which serve as a sort of academic foundation to get you started on some of the fundamental questions, and I've got some of those listed there. Disa asks, what is your day job? What is your dream job/career, and are you working towards it? My day jobs have primarily been in tech, so I've never been a full-time content creator. I've mainly worked in cybersecurity, although recently I worked at a quantum computing startup, and probably by the time this video goes out, I will be working in, yet again, another cybersecurity firm. In terms of a dream job or career, I don't really know. I really like writing, but I also really like working just with smart, engaged people. One of the most fun things about improvised comedy to me was just I was with people I found really funny. And so I guess at some point, maybe working in a writing team or working with some friends on a short film. I don't really know. I'm not sure if I'm cut out for it, but it would be nice to try it. So I'm not lying awake at night dreaming of a particular job which I don't have. In some ways, I envy those who are in such a position. I have no such clarity over what I want out of life. I think that would be quite useful. Lorix asks, any tips on how to do similar videos like you, both from a deeper/philosophical and a creative camera work, dialogue, scripts standpoint? So how to do videos, presumably TikToks, like me. My setup is a lot fancier than it needs to be. A lot of TikTokers are infinitely more successful than I am using just an iPhone. However, my setup, which you can see here, is usually a DSLR, some sort of ring light, maybe two, and occasionally some sort of sound setup. Why do I do it this way? I just sort of like it. It's more satisfying to me. I like the images it produces. I take those files, I put them into DaVinci Resolve, so I edit on my computer, which again, the vast majority of TikTokers do not do. They edit it in CapCut on their phones, but I edit in DaVinci Resolve. I like doing some sort of color correction. I used to use Sony Vegas for years before I ever used DaVinci Resolve, by the way, so that's also a program which I think is a tiny bit more beginner-friendly, although DaVinci Resolve is free. So personally, I think you should just start there if you're interested in doing it this way, which again is not efficient. So anyway, I get all the files into DaVinci Resolve, I edit the video there, and then I put the file on my phone, and then I upload it. And that's my entire technical process. In terms of writing dialogue or scenes, other than the obvious points around, practice or look at videos you really like and see why you like them, what works, I think when you're writing a script, understand that the first draft isn't going to be good. This is sort of universal rule of writing, or at least it's very rarely good. What I try and do, especially if I'm stuck, is I almost try and condense 3 lines into one. So what I mean by this is if I have, say, 2 characters and one character says, I believe this is true, and I want the other character to basically go, I don't think that is true. And then the first character follow up with, well, what problem do you have with this? And the second character goes, well, I think that this part of your argument is flawed. I can look at, in that case, a sort of 4-line exchange, and some of those lines are redundant. So the second character doesn't need to go, I don't think it's true. They can just say, I think there's a flaw here, right? So we've trimmed it down, we've sort of compressed it. So I try and look for ways I can combine layers of meaning into one line, and that produces a really succinct, layered script. And if I can, I try and add some emotional component. So, if I had a vindictive character, maybe they'd say, only a fool wouldn't spot the flaw in your argument here. So they're not only saying they disagree, they're not only articulating a flaw in the argument, but they're also saying, you're dumb. And so now we've got 3 layers in one line. That's kind of how I think about it. I'm not sure if that's useful at all. Wolf Bear Hybrid writes, oh, I have a question. How did you have the idea of making the shadow character? So the shadow character came about because I had this script idea on trying to steelman the case for revenge. It was part of a broader idea I had whereby I wanted to apply a lot of scrutiny to accepted tenets of modern wisdom, ideas that we sort of regard as really sensible without necessarily thinking about it. The problem I had it just sounded very melodramatic to try and say, okay, yeah, you should take revenge. And when I thought about filming it with just me playing both parts, it just didn't seem to land for whatever reason. But then I saw this TikTok by Lennon Sickles, and she was speaking to her shadow for a dialogue. And I went, that is an amazing format. So I thought, I'll try speaking to my shadow and make it sort of like red and moody and see if that works. And it did. So yeah. Speed Hobo says, get a yellow t-shirt. I think it'd suit you. Done. Ben Spalos writes, My question is, what kind of impact would you want to have with your profile in the next 10 years? Hey Ben, big fan of yours, as you know. I suppose the impact I want to have generally is a mixture of entertain, comfort, and undermine. Let me explain. I want to entertain because it's fun. Sometimes I like writing scripts which I hope are funny or at least mildly amusing. Not all of them are, but sometimes I try that. Comfort because I think a lot of people just really benefit from seeing their thoughts or their dilemmas articulated or played out. And a lot of the comments I get are people who say it's like I've written out their thoughts. I know I've taken a lot of solace in content which has touched on feelings and thoughts I've had about the wider world. Yeah, I suppose it just makes you feel less alone, which is nice. And the last one, undermine, because I really think sometimes we suffer, and I'm certainly super guilty of this, from certainty, in that a lot of people are so dead set that their opinions are correct and without fault. And I think that's a very risky position to be in. So I'm not sure about a 10-year horizon, but at least in the short term, I think we need less certainty as a culture in our convictions, less black and white thinking, more skepticism, but also a conviction that problems can be solved and that improvement is worthwhile. I think the problem with skepticism and to an extent cynicism is that it's a really easy emotional pit to fall into. What I want to do is I want to leverage the utility of the tools of skepticism and say, okay, well, nothing's perfect, but maybe this is the best we've got so far and that is still worthwhile, as opposed to what I think we have right now, where we have kind of the worst of both worlds, where we have absolute certainty in some convictions, but also not necessarily the emotional disposition as a culture to think that we can make things better. Smart Stupidity writes, do you think a movie version of your content would work? I feel it would be a great thing dialogue-wise, like Monogatari, for example. I haven't seen Monogatari. Do I think a movie version of my content would work? It's very flattering that you think it would. My favorite films typically have some sort of philosophical undertone, or sometimes overtone, and are dialogue heavy. So that's probably a big explainer as to why I write the videos I do. It would surprise me if I could make a movie just around a few characters talking, although obviously films like that exist, like 12 Angry Men is essentially a film just about a dilemma with justice. And as anyone who's seen it, it's just a masterstroke of filmmaking. So I'm not sure I have it in me to write a script like that, but I'd certainly like to give it a go at some point. Stella Pliakatira, sorry if I'm butchering that, asks, question, do you get motivation from the life calendar or just crippling anxiety? So if you don't know, I have a calendar of your life. This is from the organization Kurzgesagt, who you almost certainly know of. And if you don't, you should check out their YouTube channel immediately. They are fantastic. And one of the many products they sell is a life calendar. No affiliation, although Kurzgesagt, if you're watching, I wouldn't say no. This calendar basically just shows you all the weeks in your life, assuming you live to 100, and I cross off week by week as they go by. And a lot of people find this existentially terrifying, but I tend to find it, if not optimistic, at this point it doesn't really affect me. It kind of just seems like an age tracker. So I think it's optimistic because this calendar assumes that I'm going to live to be 100, and I almost certainly won't. So I try and remind myself when I'm looking at it that probably don't have this much time left. Your actual life calendar may only go up to 70 years or 60 or perhaps even less. So try and bear that in mind. But yeah, I like it. I don't know what to tell you. It's good. Thank you, Kurzgesagt. Sponsor me. Plain Lazy 4 asks, my question, what is, in your opinion, the most and least effective / useful philosophic outlook? Gosh. The problem with this question is how we define useful. Do we mean the most useful for being happy? Do we mean the most useful for being productive? Do we mean the most useful for being morally virtuous? What is morally virtuous? And so on. So in order to answer this question, I'd kind of need to ask you back one and say, what do you mean by that? But I'd say, in general, given that we assume people want some sort of level of happiness and, contribution to the world, I think I can answer what the least effective, in my opinion, is. And I got this from reading Brain Pickings, or I suppose this is now called The Marginalian by Maria Popova, where I think it's in a post where she writes the lessons she's learned from keeping it up for several years. One of the lessons was, don't just resist cynicism, fight it actively. And I think this is true. I think a lot of people are cynical, not just in their sort of outlook, but in their disposition towards the world, in that nothing is worthwhile doing, everything is worth criticizing, nothing is good. That is a really easy and seductive place to put yourself in, because I mean, there's so many old adages, right? Like, a pessimist is either constantly being proven right or happily surprised. I think what I've learned, at least in my short time on this planet, is that sometimes the conviction that things can be made better is required in order to improve them. And when cynical people go around essentially saying everything's broken and nothing's worthwhile, that doesn't help. And I think those people are just sad. It's a very addictive sadness because you're right, there are problems with everything. But I don't think anyone who lives that life is living the best life they could, probably by even their measure. In terms of the most useful philosophical outlook, I don't know. I think the other lesson I've learned is that lots of people seem to thrive with, and this is very exciting, I suppose, in life, hugely different outlooks on it and what's worthwhile to do in it. And so I think that question, unfortunately, is something that I'm going to have to put back on you, and you've got to discover your own values. But even that answer implies some level of philosophical outlook on my part, so you can't really escape the box. Sorry. Nuvo asks, what instantly excites you? A variety of things instantly excite me. The ones that I can mention here: a fresh bowl of ramen at a restaurant, a book I've been anticipating for a while, seeing an old good friend. Probably mostly that, actually. People excite me. Aside from ramen, which is about the only piece of food I actively seek out, people, thoughts, ideas, discussion, debate, those sorts of things, I can't help myself. I can't get enough of it. And also, new chapters of the various manga that I read on a weekly and monthly basis. Yeah, I look forward to those every week. If you know, you know. M writes, what piece of advice would you give to someone who's 16? I would advise someone who's 16 the following. You have time. It's really hard being a teenager and figuring out who you are and all of that, but I imagine it's particularly difficult now where you're absolutely saturated with information. But I'm going to go out on a limb and assert the following will be true in your life as it has been in mine. Number one, most of the things that you're worried about day to day will not matter, and you probably won't even remember them 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. I know that's hard to imagine, but trust me, it's true. You're only getting started. Second thing, I think it's good to make some mistakes as a teenager, but I think your primary aim should be to not make any mistakes that are so catastrophic that they seriously hamstring your future possibilities. Number three, you probably don't know how hard you can work yet. It's really exciting figuring this out. And by hard work, I don't necessarily mean at something you dislike, but I mean at something you enjoy. I know old people say this all the time, but you have so much energy at this age, and I know it doesn't feel that way, but you do. And learning how to harness your resources is such a skill, and you'll be light years ahead of everyone else if you learn how to do that. Number four, cultivating good friendships and looking after your mates is a very worthwhile thing to do. So my best friends have been with me since I was 11, and I cannot tell you how much richer my life has been because they've been with me all these years, and I've been able to support them. So look around you, and if there's someone who you really click with and really love, don't take that for granted. It's likely that most of the people you're friends with will drift away, and that's okay. That's a part of life. But probably, and if you're lucky, a few will stick around, and they're more likely to stick around if you consciously think, this is someone I want to keep in my life. So I think that's worthwhile too. And number five, don't be in such a rush to know who you want to be or what you want to do in life. I know society demands this of you, oftentimes in the schooling system or having to pick a major or a degree at university. But if you're not sure, or if you want to do a lot of things, try and just pick the thing which keeps as many doors open as possible. My undergrad, I studied physics. I also really liked philosophy, but I knew that it would probably be easier for me to pick up philosophy outside of a university context, but I knew I wouldn't have access to things like labs and lasers of that level if I didn't study physics in a university context. So I picked physics. I also knew that probably with a STEM degree, a lot of other options would remain open to me. So if you can't decide on a door, pick the door which keeps the most amount of doors open and work really hard at it. I've never regretted any time in my life where I've worked hard at something, even if it's not panned out into something I've done again, if that makes sense. You can cultivate sort of meta qualities which enrich your life beyond that time. So I hope that advice helps, and I hope it serves you well. Nick Shackleton-Jones, author, writes, question, now that you're an old man, what is your advice to young men? The same advice I give to young women, actually. I have two pieces of advice. The first is to be someone you respect. I imagine one of the main reasons it's difficult to be a young person in the world right now is that it's unclear who we should model, who should we idolize. There's a huge conflict of values happening in global culture. And so one of the ways I think you can discover who you would like being is with the following thought experiment, which I learned from a YouTube video many, many years ago. Imagine you were walking down the street and you met someone who you really liked, who you thought was really cool. What is that person like? How do they interact with you? What sort of sports or activities do they do? Do they read? Do they work out? What sort of life do they lead? Take those things you've just thought of and embody them. Do them yourself. By definition, then you will be someone that you like. You will be embodying the values that you hold. You'll be embodying those virtues that you currently hold in high esteem. Constantly do that. Re-examine what you like after doing that, and let that be a feedback loop. And I think that's a really nice way of discovering who you are and also sort of building self-esteem and self-respect, because by definition, you are someone you respect if you do that. The second advice, which is just as crucial and may seem to go against the first, is the following. Don't decide who you are. One of the great joys in life is constantly discovering new facets to yourself, new things you like and dislike and didn't know that you could do. When I was a teenager, I thought I was the sort of person who hated dancing. I was geeky and awkward. But when I was 21, I tried a dance class with some friends, and at age 22, I did some competitive ballroom. I discovered something about myself by putting myself in an environment that I hadn't been in yet, challenging myself, surprising myself, and I got a lot of joy out of it. I met some people that I never would have met otherwise. There are so many stories in my life like this, and the lives of my friends, whereby they put themselves in an environment with people, with things, with ideas, with foods that they wouldn't normally try or engage with, and they discover something, and that is amazing. So allow yourself to be a little bit malleable, and indeed also allow yourself to change. Just because you really liked something when you were 20 doesn't mean you have to really like it when you're 25. It's totally fine to outgrow things. And it's a great tragedy if someone decides who they are at 18 or 20 and just plays that same character until they die. You're so much more than that. And I think there's this sort of insidious assumption that the internet gives us, because everything we put on there is permanent, that our lives have to be as consistent and as curated as an Instagram feed, that there needs to be some sort of linear theme that goes from the bottom to the top. The most interesting lives to lead and to read about aren't like that. Don't let yours be like that. It can be chaotic. The theme can change 20 times. That's fine. That's good. Lean into it. So my advice is discover who you are by being someone you respect, but also having some level of self-doubt about making any decisions or broad claims. You are a constantly changing and evolving unit. Allow your ethics to change. Allow your likes to change. And if you combine those two, then I think that's a path to some level of maturity. So if I had to summarize it in one line, I would say, be your own person, be your own man, be your own woman. Best of luck. Crakes writes, how do you personally make sure you are not falling into a valley of bias, so deeply bonded to an idea that you can't look at things from another lens? I think some bias is inevitable, really. We never have all the information. We have our own dispositions and proclivities, and that is always going to cloud our judgment. I think you can take certain steps to make sure that that valley is a shallow one. Some of them are having friends who don't have the same opinions as you, or have opinions which differ slightly or majorly. That's really useful. The other way is through interacting with people who disagree with you and doing so in a sort of cordial manner. That's really good. Exposing yourself to ideas which are against yours and challenge yours. You've got to be careful with that second one, because I think a lot of people actually define themselves in opposition to another group. And so you may live a life whereby all you hear are opinions you disagree with. And so you become really stuck in your ways because you hear stupidity. I think social media and the internet is driven to show you sometimes the least generous view of a viewpoint, or the most extreme or dumbest or absurd caricature of a viewpoint. And so if your only representation of views different from yours are really dumb, maybe you're not seeing the other side of the case as fully as you could. So other than that, reading and just being open to new information. Another way of checking that you're not falling into a valley of bias is to see whether you've changed your mind on anything in the last, few months or years. If you haven't, do you really know everything? I don't know. I think the best we can do is to have the viewpoints and make decisions that make sense given the information we have at the time. And so as you learn more, I would hope that another indication that you're not falling into a valley of bias is that your viewpoints do alter. And if that doesn't happen, then yeah, maybe you need to reevaluate. But that's my best guess so far. I'm afraid I don't have any absolute root out of that conundrum. Kazamin66 asks, in one of your older videos, I saw you had a OnePlus 9. If I am not blind, I see you have an iPhone 14 or 15 Pro Max. How has your tech experience been? So I have both phones here. I prefer Android, but I got an iPhone because videos wouldn't really upload properly on Instagram, and social media apps work better on this. Plus also, this is an iPhone 14 Max. The camera is just superb. So if I want to film without the DSLR, I use this. So if it weren't for the better camera and social media apps working, at least in my anecdotal experience, I'd still be an Android guy. but that's why I have an iPhone. Andrew Scott writes, how do you get subtitles on your videos? There are 3 ways I get subtitles on my videos. Number 1 is through using the native subtitle feature on TikTok or Instagram. Number 2 is through using Descript. This is really good. And number 3 is through using the premium version of DaVinci Resolve, which can create subtitles out of a timeline. So one of those 3. Typhoon Guy writes, what about a video on how best to spend a human life, pleasure and happiness versus goals and achievements versus serving others, etc.? So again, I think it's not really up to me to tell you how to live your life. That is a question, unfortunately, the burden of which is on you. Although there are many prepackaged answers and a lot of people who are very willing to take your money in order to give you a response, and perhaps that'll be comforting, and it'll only be on your deathbed where you realize that, maybe I should have thought about that a little bit more. That's a bit of a haunting way of putting it. That being said, I will give my 2 cents. For free. I think there's a place for a counter melody depending on what your disposition is. One piece of writing which always resonated with me, who probably has a disposition to work a little bit too hard, was the essay Lazy Manifesto by Tim Kreider, which, to paraphrase, basically says when you're on your deathbed, you may wish you had worked harder, but what you'll probably want more of is more time with loved ones and family. You'll want one more late night out with a good friend or laugh with a loved one. And that line really stuck with me. I don't think I've ever regretted any time I've spent with loved ones. That being said, hard work and achievement is also important to me. So it's a balance for me, like you. I'm afraid I don't have any enlightened answers. And even if I had worked it out for myself, I'm not sure it would apply for you. I think that's one of the fun problems we have to deal with day to day in life. But I would say that if you're in a position to choose, that's probably pretty enviable. So that was the Q&A. If you've watched all of it, thank you so much. I hope to be delivering more long-form-esque content on here soon. If you'd like to see any of my other videos, here are some. Otherwise, have a wonderful day.